I'm Simon Kilmurry, and I'm so happy to be talking with director Violet Feng about her new film, Hidden Letters. Violet, great to see you.
Great to see you, Sam. It's so great to talk to you here.
Congratulations on this film. It's been one that I have been following for quite a few years as you've been in production on it. But when I watched it the other evening, I was really struck by just what a beautiful film this is. I mean, just
Thank you.
visually, emotionally, character-wise, it's just a gorgeous film. I was curious to know you as a Chinese filmmaker, as a Chinese woman, what was your first encounter with Nushu, and what was your reaction to it?
So I read the book from Lisa C. Called Snowflower and Secret Fan. That was when I graduated from Berkeley for graduate school, and so that was like I think it must be 2005 or 2006. It was a very long time ago, and it was a novel based on the secret language. And I remember feeling ashamed of myself as a Chinese woman that I knew nothing about it growing up, and I knew that the majority of Chinese don't know anything about it. So that stuck in my mind of my first reaction about learning new show of how it gave me goosebumps and like just really fascinated by the story and also by the conditions of these women created this language from and how I knew nothing about. And I felt like that should be part of, as a Chinese woman, that should be part of my history, that should be part of my identity, but I knew nothing about it.
It is both striking in its exploration of the historical emergence of this secret language, but also in the contemporary, um, uh, uh, how it's being kind of manipulated in the kind of contemporary space. But let's talk a little bit about the kind of historical emergence for those who perhaps haven't seen the film yet. Um, give the kind of brief overview of how Nushu as a secret language developed and why.
So for thousands of years, in Chinese history in ancient China, that women are born to obey their husbands, their sons, and their husband sons, and I forgot one, and their fathers, of course. And so they were deprived rights of education. So there's actually no record of women's literature, very few records of women's literature in China, and that actually the only existing record of literature written by women was like elite status and coming from family who's you know quite wealthy and or higher status. So you never really see writings from women from like lower income families or like poor families. It just doesn't exist. So like under that kind of context, in this secluded village in central China, in Hunan province, there are actually a few villages that during the feudal society, women there had bound feet and locked in a chamber room. So instead of having their voice silenced, they decided to create a language among themselves. And besides the language that they will share poems and songs to write to each other about, they also have this really well thought out structure of sisterhood that they build among themselves in line with the language. So because of the existence of the language and also the sisterhood, these women were able to survive and also like share their sufferings and share their resilience and build powers from the community. And it was passed down from generation to generation, and eventually that now it's the youngest generation who's trying to revive the language.
It's interesting. I think that in terms of using language as a form of building sisterhood, as a form of kind of subverting the oppression which they're living under, they essentially create an art form, and use art, use music and poetry and this communicated through the secret language as a way to liberate themselves, to support each other. Um, Talk about you're an artist. Talk about that use of art as a form of, you know, creative self-expression, as a form of resistance.
Um, I think there's so many parallel of what these women were doing and how I am also as a female filmmaker trying to struggle myself in this career because I dedicate myself to tell Chinese stories and also lifting up voices from China, especially female voices from China from female artists. But it's not an easy journey, like we're dealing with a community that's still pretty male dominant in a way, and also like I think it's really hard to have the space for female filmmakers to find our own voice because like there's many layer of suppression. There is the societal suppression, that is patriarchal, and there's also the industry suppression, and it's also like like from our education growing up, it's just not a very kind of like open environment to support us to find our own voices. So I think that there is a lot of challenges in there, but I mean for me I don't think that it's really easy to talk it as like a straightforward kind of like way about okay, this is what we're dealing with. So that's why I felt like you should serve as a vehicle for me to deal with all these issues myself even. And that what these women created back then, the hundreds of years ago, they use a language, they use something else to find power of themselves as a community from within. And I'm also thinking that for me, using Yushu as a window to really look at, the landscape of suppressions that we're dealing with, and also how, as the filmmakers, we can support each other and build a community. I mean, this is a film that produced by all female filmmakers. And like it's not just from China. We have a really strong producing team of female from Norway, from Germany, from US. So I think that that itself is a showcase of like when we're stuck together and lifting each other up, like good work can come from that.
The the contemporary stories in the film, uh, as told through Sima and Hujin, um, uh, I think are remarkably beautiful. Um, uh, and it's especially so when it's offset against the increasing commercialization, almost bastardization of Nushu as an art, as a female language. You have several instances in the film where you have these men telling these women how Nushu should be used, exploited, commercialized, profited from. Talk a little bit about how Nushu is the tension that Nushu is kind of currently existing in. It was striking to me that the sheer joy that Sima expresses in her face and in her movement when she's creating using Nushu, contrasted with the hyper commercialized capitalism, capitalist exploitation of the art form.
Yeah, I keep saying that actually I think that China went through a huge societal changes, and then I grew up in a time that's more communist where gender equality was very much pushed, and then like there's no gender income gap, and it was the time that I went back to China in 2010 that did I see that the country's become so capitalistic in a way that it also plays a role of how capitalism plays a role in gender inequality. And I feel very present when I was moving back. Then the gender income gap becomes so vastly like big, and how women are, because of that, women are living under, a lot of these pressures, and in a way that it actually brought us back to, these family duties in a way that's actually going backwards. So I am really trying to find a way to make a comment about how capitalism actually plays a role in making the inequality in gender dynamics, particularly in China. But I don't think it's just China, it's everywhere. We actually did our first test screening in Norway because we did a final post in Norway. And I remember like we had a very small sample audience, and even the women there were talking about how capitalism plays a role in, unbalancing the gender dynamic there. So that's one thing that I was really trying to make a point of. And then even the last product of what women created are suffering from capitalism. Um, and the other part that I was really trying to use these things to help audience to really see men's reaction to New Shu, more so importantly is men's reaction to women. I think that I'm, in these things, like some of the men may not come up so flattering, but in a way, I'm also trying to show that how they're also trapped in their way of thinking about their perceptions and exceptions. We actually, this film, I really am hoping to finding a way to also connect to men so that we can have a better understanding of where our gap is and how do we, really align with that gap of understanding of our gender perceptions towards each other. So, like besides those things, we actually throughout the film are trying to kind of also show using some of the things that how men are actually trapped in their own roles and in their own expectations from the society and from the system and from cultural also. So anyway, so those things I think serve multiple purposes in a way that when I was trying to, construct them.
Well, those the kind of ancient values, I think it's obedience, acceptance, and resilience that's expected. And it was so interesting to see that play out between Simu and her fiance and the family, the kind of the expectation of roles, which in some ways felt
Exactly.
very old fashioned. And then you have that wonderful section of the film where you look back at the Cultural Revolution or the years or years of progress of greater equality for women under prior in prior years, which um, uh, has somehow we've gone off track and gone back to a way of older way of thinking.
Yeah. I think it's becoming kind of like a trend. It's also like it's not just capitalism. Of course, I'm not trying to simplify it. I think it's also where the society is going, and then also how, the whole country is trying to revive the Chinese Renaissance, kind of like the big Chinese um, DNA identity. And as part of that wave, there has been a lot of like conversations about bringing back the traditional values in that the traditional virtues of women was part of that. So there has been like workshops around the countries, particularly about, like traditional female virtues and how do we bring it back. And in that kind of like backdrop, I think they're also using Yushu to serve that kind of purpose, which is totally, opposite to what was it created for.
And like you say, that kind of reversion to older values is not only in China; it's happening elsewhere. The princess camp, I think, is something that you could easily see in the United States.
Sadly, yes.
So there's definitely parallels, which I thought were fascinating. I want to talk a little bit about He Yangjing. How do
Yes.
you, is that?
He Yanxin, yes.
Yeah, who's such a steely, wonderful person to spend time with in the film. She's kind of our link to the past, but also the generous kind of giver of knowledge to the next generation. Um, Talk about your first encounter with her and how you managed to win her trust because she's a tough cookie.
She was. I mean, she didn't. Okay, so the first time there was a biography book about her, and I was already in love with her after reading that without meeting her. So I knew actually before the two young women, I knew that I wanted to cast her. So the first scouting trip when I met her, I was actually I got the proper permission from the local government and everything. So I went to meet her, but I didn't know that she actually thought I was sent by the authority. So she actually didn't want to she talked to me, but she didn't want me to turn on the camera for the whole day. So we spent, several hours together, but I can see her resistance in that regard. And it was until that I casted Hu Xin did I realize that, they actually have a really deep relationship between these two women. And the second time I went to visit her with Hu Xin, she completely forgot who I was from the first time. So we started a very different relationship from then on. I mean, to me, she's such, um, you know, uh, an incredible woman who represent the strength and spirit that Nushu has passed down to her. She actually not only refused to get married with her husband from arranged marriage, she also refused to acknowledge that she actually knew Nushu for many, many years because to her, Nushu represent the best memories of her entire life, which is her childhood, and it represents the love she had from her grandparents. So when her grandmother died, she felt like her happiest day was over. So she burned all her writings with her grandmother. And since then, she just didn't tell anybody she knew Nushu. And there's actually a shift in Nushu, I think, why it was actually for a while that it actually was kind of went extinct, partially because of the Cultural Revolution, um, right around that time that all everybody was like pushed, like what we said in the film, like the Great Leap Forward time, that all the women were pushed to write. So there we lost the function of really Nushu, but also during the Cultural Revolution, all these women who actually practiced Nushu were treated like ghosts. So nobody was willing to say that they actually know Nushu. So since then, like nobody knew actually she learned Nushu traditionally and naturally from her grandmother. It was until I think it was in the late 80s or 90s, it might be around that, but like her swan sister was so poor, and then but she's trying to bring some income to her family by sewing the Nushu belts, and she was asking around for people for help, who knows how to read Nushu, and nobody could help her. And in the end, she stepped up. She said, "Okay, I actually know this." So she helped her, and it was the very reason that she's supporting her sister that she revealed herself that she actually know Nushu. And since then she's been like, I think she's one of the very last living master that really know the true spirit, represent the true spirit of Nushu.
There's some wonderfully emotional scenes with her, at least emotional for me as a viewer, when she goes back to her, I think it's her childhood home. Um, uh, and then when she's just sitting quietly with Hujin, um, you see, you feel this kind of palpable, deep, both reverence and bond between them. I want to ask you just what, as a filmmaker, what it's like to be in those spaces, witnessing that, because it just felt so emotionally resonant, in both those moments.
I think it was so resonating with me too, because I knew that, at a point when Hu Xin was having the divorce, I know that she's at a very low point of her life. And I wanted to follow her because I know that Nushu is going to play a different role in her life, no matter what that is. But I didn't know that actually that role is through the bond with Hui Yanxin. So every time that I went to, or my cousin, who's my co-director, went to visit Hu Xin, she would take us to He. So we really see the evolvement of their relationship to the point that when we, like they actually were speaking their local dialect, but so like when we're filming, a lot of times me and the cinematographer, we don't actually understand their conversations, but the emotion was so there, was so present that, I just try to be not intrusive of those moments because I could really, really feel it. Yeah, especially when they were, comparing their palms and talking about how long He Yanxin will live. Yeah, I was doing sound at a time, although I didn't know what they were talking about, but I remember like I was kind of shedding tears.
That is such a wonderful, tender moment when she takes Hei hand, and he says, "You have the hand of an 18-year-old." It's so
Yes.
beautiful. It's just
Yeah, but my favorite moment is when Hu Xin was sharing what her wrote to Hu Yanxin, because like a part of the Chinese culture is there's so much that we don't really say. We just, let it play out, and we don't really share verbally. So when Hu Xin write how she felt about Hu Yanxin, that was the moment that I felt like she's truly like expressing her love for her. And her initial response was like, it doesn't rise. And I gotta correct you, this is something that's wrong that you wrote. And
Yeah.
it's such a grandmother's love, because they
Yeah.
wouldn't say that, respond in a way that, thank you so much. They will never say that, but they will say in a way that you can so feel that their love is so strong, but in a criticizing way.
Yeah, no, you feel that it comes through so beautifully. I mean, it's one of the things which I think is so lovely about the film is this is a film that's filled with moments of nuance and subtlety. And I wanted to talk about the kind of the visual language that you use for the film, the kind of the cinematic approach that you took, because there's lingering moments of on faces where you see so much going on, but nothing's being said. There's the beautiful contrast between small villages and rural scenes and cities. Talk about how you decided to kind of visually approach telling the story.
I think the visual approach to of this film, I knew from the beginning that it's going to be a beautiful film, but I also wanted to make sure that it's honest film, and that represents in the visual language too. And so like these kind of moments to me is like golden, because that represent where women are in our place. And it also came through because the way that I collaborated with the cinematographer, our two cinematographer were actually men, but they're like really wonderful people that I've, my cousin and I work in the past. So we came up with this pattern of working that actually every day, no matter how late we film, actually insisted by one of my cinematographer that we'll go back to the hotel, we'll load all the footage, we'll watch everything, and we will discuss every single scene and how I see it and how he sees it. And because of those deep communications, based on footage of how I see where women's responses are. So I think by the end of, like two shoots that were together, after that, I think he understands so deeply of, how I wanted to point out the camera and how what I wanted to capture and what kind of like moments is important. So there are shoots like during the pandemic that I actually sent him alone to film, and it, like that reflects, the kind of like understanding we had. And the other thing I wanted to actually mention is that throughout the journey of the production, you might have already known that I always wanted to develop this animation to tell the backstory. I pitched when I was at Hot Dogs, I also had a scene of, we actually spent months and tons of money to develop the animation, the look, because I was really struggling because I knew that how important it is to tell the backstory in order for the contemporary story to work. So how do I kind of share the depths and the richness of the backstory of what these Mushu really represent. So I thought animation was the only way. And then we, developed a look that was really, really beautiful. And I thought that, I have a vehicle and I have a tool to do that. But by the time that we actually were editing and put that in, both my editor and I start to realize that we're actually romanticizing these women's experience from the past. And like it's so different from the unbearable actually, context they're living under. So however way that we construct visually in animation is going to romanticize their experience, and that's not something we wanted to do. So instead of that, we took all out and decided to really marry the poems with, the room that they were living under, which we actually filmed the chamber room of where He Xing lived. And it was, luckily abandoned for decades of years, but it was really her chamber room when she was little. And we really wanted to use that space to help audience to experience the kind of space that they wrote these letters under, and then the kind of like confinement that physically that they were living under. So I think that as soon as we figure that out, it kind of worked.
That works. It works beautifully. Um, Talk about some of the challenges you have as a director of um, creating a film that's exploring this topic that speaks both to Chinese and to non-Chinese audiences. Um, uh, I'm curious if there are any particular storytelling challenges that you encounter in doing
Yeah,
that.
for sure. There are many actually, but I think what anchors me are the kind of questions that I'm, trying to guide me through this process. Like I know from the very beginning of every film that I make about China, it has to be serving a perspective that's needed and also is currently absent even from my own community. That's very important to me. So I wanted to hold myself accountable that I'm making a film that's needed even in China. But also I wanted to make sure there's a universal entry point for people outside of China. Um, and also not feeding in a way that's like feeding into the kind of mainstream stereotypes about what the West is looking at China. That's also absolutely important for me. And I think that in that way, it is about how I'm not simplifying the stories, how I'm actually not scapegoating any party to serve as antagonist in the film, and how do I serve kind of layers for people who are out of our country to understand it in a more deeper and enriched way, of like why it becomes this way of women's experiences in China, and what are the elements that really serve as factors that really suppresses us. So it's like there's many complex factors, and I'm hoping that by going deep in the emotions in the internal space of these women, we actually can reveal these complexity. um and also another challenge is that any story that we made about China, I think the level of accountability as a filmmaker to protect our subjects so that they're not in danger for any kind of they can easily lose their job or freedom. How do we tell the story, and then also kind of have a radical perspective, but using kind of subtle and then nuanced way to tell their story so that they will not be, in jeopardy of anything as a consequence of being the subject in the film. So like all of these, I think, are important questions to guide me through in terms of how do I approach the characters, and what are the things that I'm actually select to get into the film, and what actually I deliberately not selecting to be part of the film, and how can I connect emotionally and intellectually to people outside of China, and how can I still use this film to make an impact on the target audience in China so that we can hopefully move the needle a little bit.
Mhm. Mhm. Has the film been shown yet in China?
Not yet, but we're hoping it will soon.
Good. I often think that the more specific a film is about its topic, about the people who are participating, the more universal it can become. And I think through the stories of Fujin and of Simu, there's a universality to their experience, which I think many people, many women will recognize regardless of where they're coming from.
As a man, how do you feel like it resonate in any way with you? I'm
As
always
as
really curious.
well, as a male, I felt uh, I mean, I was both blown away by Hujin and Simu as people, by their kind of this kind of quiet power, which you sometimes see they're doubting themselves a little bit, but then they force through. But I was also looking at some of the men in the film, going, "Oh my gosh, I think I have been like that in those meetings." So I also recognize myself in their dreadful attitudes. So that's quite revealing.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great to hear.
Yeah. Um, uh, you've been on a long festival journey with the film, winning awards all over the place. Where are you off to next? What's the next journey for the film?
So we're in actually a month, we're gonna start theatrical release. So it's going to be in New York, December 9th at Landmark Quad, and then it's going to be in LA in Orange County and Regal. And then also we're going to have a premiere screening at Lamalay in LA. And we're getting bookings around the country, even in London, I think. So we'll have a detailed schedule of theatrical release coming up. And it's going to be on independent lens next year in May.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Violet. It is a remarkably beautiful film. I'm
Thank
going
you
to
so
be
much.
telling people to go see this, and you know, good luck as you move forward.
I'm so grateful for your support. Thank you, Simon.